Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I live in Florida, so the cold weather is a little bit different. I spent actually the last week in the Bay Area, and I'm becoming more and more aware of the different things going on here to make people aware of and prepare for sea level rise. And just to echo the words of all of the people who spoke before me, but I think we need to really appreciate the political leadership here, both Supervisor Fine and Congresswoman Speier and Senator Gordon at the different levels. But also I think we really need to recognize all of you here today, because for 300 people to come out and be concerned about this issue indicates that you know something different is happening. This is an unusual issue. Some people think it's controversial. It's a strange issue because it happens so slowly. We only see it during those days of extreme tides when we get flooding. But most of you realize, and I assume by the very fact that you're here on a brisk Monday morning, that this is something profound. And so at every level, I want to really honor, not just thank you, but congratulate you on your concern for not only what happens tomorrow or the next extreme tide or the next storm, but for something that at some level you recognize is different than through all of human history. The title here, Planning Ahead, sounds redundant, but it's purposeful. We plan all the time. We plan for things next week, we plan for street changes, new housing divisions, and so on. But usually when we plan, we're doing it incrementally. We're planning the way we've always done it. Sometimes you plan for events that you don't know exactly when they're going to happen, like an earthquake, which you're very familiar with out here. You still plan for them. What's different about sea level rise is sea level has not been higher than the present for 120,000 years. So it's the one thing that we need to plan for that's going to change everything that we have no prior experience with. And that's what makes it different. It's not in the human experience. 120,000 years ago, sea level got 25 feet higher than it is today. That's part of the natural ice age cycles. But again, that's outside the realm of human experience. So what I want to help you do today is put in context sea level rise and begin to envision a different world. And this is no longer a hypothesis. And while some people would like to make it controversial, and we can argue about or disagree about how high might it get by the end of the century, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the fact that the oceans are warmer, they are measurably 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they were a century ago, is the basic issue. In a warmer ocean, which is a big heat zone, giant outdoor swimming pool, and a warmer ocean means the ice sheets are going to continue to get smaller. Of course, when we start to think of sea level rise in this area, one of the first things that everybody imagines is San Francisco Airport. And for good reason. It's large, and it's low, and it's flat, and an important part of this economy and community. And in the next segment, you're going to hear more about the local area from an expert, Will Travis. But I want to remind you before we even get started, before I take you on a global view, to show you some factors of sea level rise, and again, put it in the historical context to give it certainty and clarity, and talk about why we can't exactly say how much sea level rise we'll have this century. It's not just limited to the very low areas that we think of right on the ocean. Sacramento, which of course is very important here, is some 80 miles away, and Sacramento's on a tidal river. Not only is it vulnerable to sea level rise, a federal analysis, actually combined with some state work a few years ago, determined that Sacramento is more vulnerable to the failure of earthen levees than New Orleans. Some of you probably know that. But it's not only the state capital that's at risk, it's some of the most valuable farmland in the world. So even though we tend to think of sea level at a very narrow level, we have to consider that this is something really profound. It's going to be the biggest change to this planet this century. How can I say that? Well, there'll be a lot of changes, of course, but this will be the one that you can see in the next satellite photo from outer space. The famous shots we all look at for Earth. The boundary between the ocean and the land is going to change to the point where you can see the difference. Nothing's more profound than that. It defines where we can live. While there's been confusion and some arguments about climate change, global warming, whatever you wish to call it, of course on a morning like this we might wish it was warmer, but it's becoming recognized, as you probably saw a couple of months ago, the cover of National Geographic, certainly an accepted and not an outlandish publication, but put it right on the cover, and they actually did something rather extreme. They created a map showing what happens when all the ice melts. Antarctica and Greenland, 212 feet of sea level rise. Now that's not, I'm not too sure that that does us a service, because it's kind of paralyzing. And it can happen this century, it can happen next century, it can happen the century after that. So I'm not too sure that that's good communication, frankly. What I want to talk to you about is to put things in a realistic concept of what should we plan for in the decades ahead, and thinking ahead a century for our grandchildren. I'd like to cover as simply as possible the basic science and facts, because there is a bit of confusion about what causes sea level rise. Some of it you probably know, some of you here probably have it exactly right, but I want to make sure we don't have misunderstandings about the causes of sea level rise and the magnitudes and what can happen. And at the end of my talk, I'll be glad to take questions, time permitting. So we want to talk about how high could it get and how soon, and then within the uncertainties, what are they? Make sure we understand them. And then I would like to share with you from my experience in the last year and a half since my book's been out. I'm traveling around and trying to figure out how do we inform and inspire without having people shut down and kind of get paralyzed by this really strange new reality. That can be paralyzing. So I'd like to share some perspectives with you. The first thing to remind us ourselves is something that probably is buried in your intuitive awareness, but is worth pointing out. Sea level is the base level, and it hasn't changed in a few thousand years, so we just assumed it was a constant, but it's not. Sea level moves up and down hundreds of feet over geologic time, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But on top of sea level rise, we have the daily tides. And then a few days a month and at certain times of the year, the tides are extreme. Lunar tide, full moon, new moon tides. That's when the streets flood unusually, and at certain times of the year. And then, of course, we know what a storm is. Not more affecting, of course, the Pacific coast part of San Mateo County, but also the storm surge can have impacts even in the Bay Area, although muted. And it's as those three things pile up that the maximum height of the moment is attained, which determines how far inland the water reaches. But what's different that very few people stop to think about is that the tide cycle is 6 hours. The storm surge recedes within a day or two. The land is still there after those two events. What's different about sea level rise is sea level is a very slow phenomenon. And while it's slow to show itself, it's slow to disappear. It will take centuries, in fact thousands of years, for the ice sheets to expand enough to reduce sea level, to allow it to drop. We don't tend to think of that. So while the three things combine, the big difference is that sea level won't go away. So as it goes, it may be the tortoise, the inch by inch by inch, as opposed to the big storm surge or the tide rise. But sea level just keeps getting higher. We'll talk about that. But it's the fundamental difference. So first let's look at what's happened with sea level rise over the last century, effectively, a little more than that here. But if we take the middle part of this, this shows the average sea level change in the world over the last 100 years. And it's risen about 8 inches. And actually, while it varies in different places, right here in the San Francisco Bay Area, it's about the global average, about 8 inches. Now, when a lot of people look at, or even want to argue about sea level rise, they tend to talk about the little ups and downs. And I suggest it's a little bit like talking about stocks or gold prices or anything else. You can get ground up in all the details of the little blips, or you can look at the long-term picture. And the long-term picture of global sea level rise from hundreds of tide stations around the world, and now satellite data, is pretty clear. If you could buy that stock, you'd probably want to do it, wouldn't you? It wouldn't matter what it did last week. But sea level rise, one of the reasons it's confusing is it doesn't affect every place the same. That same 8 inches of rise shown as a red wavy line toward the bottom varies from Los Angeles on the right at 4 inches, to New York in the middle at 14 inches, to New Orleans on the left at 46 inches. Then that's counterintuitive. You'd think that water would find its level and be the same everywhere. But the difference is that land moves up and down slowly, tectonically, as you know, here in California. And the reason that Los Angeles has less sea level rise apparent than here is because the land down there has risen another 4 inches more than the Bay Area over the last century. Imperceptible, but it has a big impact on the apparent sea level change in different areas. We need to go up to the Arctic to start to talk about what's causing sea level and to get rid of some misinformation. You've all seen images like this lone polar bear, which are perhaps charismatic, perhaps emotional about what's going to happen as the ice disappears. And I'm not going to get into that today. I certainly agree with a lot of that. But our problems are way beyond the polar bear. They happen where we live, here in the Bay Area and elsewhere. And the melting Arctic ice cap does not add to sea level rise, and that surprised a lot of people to learn. Some of you probably know that. But it's because those are floating chunks of ice, and like ice cubes in a glass, as they melt, they do not change the level of liquid in the glass. Whether it be iced tea or the Arctic Ocean, it doesn't make any difference. It's already floating, so its weight is displaced, and it doesn't change the level of the liquid. That's a big surprise to people. Sea level rise comes from a few sources. Again, once an iceberg is in the ocean, it's no longer affecting sea level rise. But when you get to where those icebergs come from, and in the Arctic, a lot of them come from Greenland, so we're going to go there in a second. But simply stated, sea level rise comes from just a few things. As seawater warms up, it expands. Most substances, parts don't fit. Maybe something this morning in the 25-degree weather didn't fit right the way it normally does in your car, in your house key or something like that, and it's because parts expand slightly. And the ocean, seawater expands slightly. And the ocean is about 3 or 4 inches higher than it was a century ago, purely because it's warmer. And that will continue. And then the glaciers are melting, and as glaciers melt and run into the ocean, they affect sea level. But all of the glaciers in the world, and that's nearly 200,000 glaciers, when they all melt, will raise the ocean about 2 or 3 feet. Significant, but not the big deal. The big deal starts in Greenland as glaciers calve off into icebergs. And I want to take in a quick tour there from a trip I did in 2007. Just to help you visualize that where the icebergs come from is the face of the glacier. And as you travel up the glacier by helicopter, you get to see visibly what a glacier is. It's that bending river of ice. And when you get up to the top of the ice sheet, and there's only 2 big ice sheets in the world, major ice sheets. One is at the top of Greenland, and one is in Antarctica. As you get to the top of the 2-mile thick ice sheet that's in Greenland, which is similar to the ice sheet that used to cover North America during the Ice Age, we begin to see the problem. On the far left, that sheen is the meltwater. And there's no mountains here. This isn't water coming from somewhere else, like in California coming from the Sierra Nevada. This water is just happening because of the melting. And it gathers in these rivulets and streams, bigger and bigger streams. For scale, those are the 2 helicopters in the background. And you've probably seen photos in National Geographic and elsewhere again. These are torrents of water. They find a crack, they work their way straight down to the bottom of the ice sheet. 2 things happen. That water does add to sea level when it reaches the ocean. And also, as it lifts the ice off the bedrock, the glaciers are speeding up 2 and 3 times their speed, meaning they're calving off icebergs that much faster, which does add to sea level rise. When I was there in 2007, the helicopter pilots and scientists estimated there were about 100 of these moulins, or vertical shafts. Friends who were back there in 2012, which was a record warm year, that there were 1,000 of them. So without any arguments about the accuracy of the instruments or anything else, you can just count these number of these vertical streams carrying the meltwater. And a 10-fold increase in 5 years is astounding. To give you the other piece of the puzzle, because Greenland, when it melts entirely, and again it can't happen this century, won't happen next century, would add 24 feet to global sea level, 10 times what glaciers would. But the big kahuna is Antarctica. Antarctica is got 7 times more frozen water, snow and ice, than Greenland. So when it melts entirely, and again, here's where I think National Geographic may have done a slight disservice, is because it can't happen for centuries, probably thousands of years, to melt entirely and flood the southeast United States, etc. Sea level will rise 185 feet. But we need to find the right path between enlightenment and facts and just being scared to the point where we can't do anything. And that's really important, that we talk with facts. What I do that's different is put sea level in the context of the ice ages, which gives it a certainty and a clarity. And so I want to take you back to the ice age, and I know some of you don't like science probably, and you're probably starting to get squeamish that maybe this is going to get too technical. But bear with me, I want to refresh your memories about the 4-part documentary series. You have kids or grandkids, you've probably seen this, probably not as many times as I had to watch it. I have a 12-year-old daughter. And when Ice Age Part 2, The Meltdown, came out, I think I had to watch it about 20 or 30 times, so I've really got it memorized now. And behind Diego and Manny and Sid and the other creatures here, there's 2 miles of ice. And I show it there not only to lighten up the mood, because this does get pretty heavy for a moment, but on top of that, it's a simple visual that 2 miles of ice, roughly 10,000 feet, as it melts, it's what caused the ocean to rise 390 feet. But again, what this simple graph shows is that it doesn't rise smoothly. And it's been at this height for about 6,000 or 8,000 years. And there's a lot of knowledge in this simple image. As the ice sheets melted from 20,000 years ago during the peak of the last ice age, it seems like a long time ago, but when you think about, even ancient biblical times, and 5,000 years is not too far to imagine back in our historical record. Well, 4 times that age ago, not that far ago, not that long ago, I should say. Sea level was down 390 feet, but here's the amazing thing. For human civilization goes back around 6,000 years, depending upon your metric, but certainly doesn't go back 10,000 years. Our written records go back about 6,000 or 8,000 years. We have some archaeologic shards that go back 40,000 years, perhaps, but human civilization as we know it is less than 10,000 years old. 6,000 or 8,000 would be the normal estimate that most archaeologists and historians would give. For that whole period of time, sea level's been pretty much where it is today. So that's the reason we tend to disbelieve it's going to change. Because again, for all of our human history, it's been there. Now, to put it in simple visual terms, if we were at the 30th floor of a building, just 20,000 years ago, sea level was at the ground floor. And when? And I again want to stress when. Not this century, not next century, not the century thereafter. But when all the remaining ice on the planet melts, sea level will rise another 17 floors. Now, if that paralyzes you, just catch yourself. Okay? If we have 500 years or 5,000 years to deal with this, we can manage. Let's be realistic. Our challenge is, what do we do in our lifetimes for planning for our children and grandchildren so that our investments in our community and our businesses are positive and have a return on investment, that they're designed for the environment that they will find. We do not need to worry about what's going to happen 300 years from now or 3,000 years from now. It's like anything else. I mean, it's like hearing you've got a terrible medical condition. You kind of have to take one step at a time. Let's try and swallow the giant animal in chunks. This is the last technical graph I'm going to show you. This isn't going to be a science lecture. One of the things that I do in terms of explaining the science of sea level is not only to put it in historical perspective, but I like it to be such that any high school student can understand it. The truth is that any intelligent person who understands English language can understand this. You don't need a scientific background. But this one slide I'm going to spend about a minute on, and if any of you want to send me an email, I'll even let you have this slide to use for your outside educational efforts, and I'll tell you how to do that in a minute. But this single graph is an entire course in climate and sea level. It's 420,000 years from left to right, and it's 3 different reference points. The top is a greenhouse gas in green, CO2. The middle is the global average temperature in red for heat, make it easy to remember. And bottom is in blue, the sea level. Now you see the 3 lines go up and down. And the first thing you notice is they go up and down together. You already see that? Kind of line up. The peaks are all in sync. There are slight differences. Nobody would expect they'd be exactly the same, but that's not a coincidence. And the 2 or 3 points I'd like to just make to you are this, that they each have a normal boundary. Sea level moves up and down about 350 feet with each ice age. The ice age pattern about every 100,000 years, based upon a solar variation called the Milankovitch cycle, says the global average temperature varies about 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And CO2, carbon dioxide, has a range of 180 to 280. And again, I round things off to make them easy to remember. The problem is in the far upper right of the screen. Can you see that little straight line in the red circle in the far upper right? Everybody see that? Maybe they're stunned you or you're frozen still. That the problem is that carbon dioxide is now approaching 400 parts per million, 40% higher than the normal range of the last 10 million years. And CO2 and carbon do go in unison. Interestingly, one can cause the other to change, but they move together, and I can tell you why, or if you get my book, you'll find it out. But it's on my website too. But it's a very simple physics phenomenon. CO2 traps heat. That's a principle of physics figured out about 180 years ago. And as the oceans warm, they release CO2. So they go together, and there's a cause and effect. The problem now is we're raising CO2 fast enough that we don't know how quickly temperature will rise, nor do we know how quickly you can melt the ice sheets. The takeaways from this are a couple. If you look at sea level in the lower right, we are at the high spot of the historic sea level cycles, just as we're at the high spot of the traditional cycles of CO2 and temperature. Now things should be headed cooler, growing ice, and dropping sea level, based upon the ice age cycles of the last 5 million years. Those three things are going in the wrong direction, or unnatural direction. With me? Make sense so far? That we've got a natural cycle, there are natural climate cycles. The best indication of that is the ice ages, which as the planet gets colder and evaporation happens and rainfall and snow, that the ice sheets build up over tens of thousands of years. And as the ice sheets grow, the oceans drop. And it is a natural cycle. But it's changed now. CO2 is going up, temperature's rising 1.5 degrees, the ocean's rising 8 inches, and they're all heading faster and faster. That's the climate course, okay? The other thing is that, well, the other proof of that is that 100,000 year cycle, again, there's 420,000 years left to right, that 100,000 year cycle between the peaks breaks down to one other interesting thing is that the sea level, well, actually all three of the metrics, descend for about 80,000 years and then rise for about 20,000. One of those many things in life that's an 80-20 rule. And I didn't understand that until I put the case together in my book, to tell you the truth. I really assumed it was 50-50, and it's not. But it's really important because that's why, again, we're at the high point. Sea level has risen for 20,000 years, and it should be about at the turning point. Now, somebody said to me, challenged me on TV, so he said, so you're saying that sea level this year should be going down? I said, no, I didn't say that. Geologic time doesn't work like that. It's a 100,000 year cycle. But somewhere this century, we should have been at the turning point, where we're heading 80,000 years toward the next ice age. Well, we've solved that problem. You can put away the winter clothes. We're not going to have an ice age in 80,000 years. How do we know that? Ice core data, I'm not going to get too deeply into it. The first question people always say is, well, how could you possibly know what ancient temperatures and carbon dioxide levels were without instruments? Well, fortunately, nature's preserved a really good sample set going back 800,000 years in the ice cores of Greenland and Antarctica, and those little bubbles in the photo at the lower right are air samples that were tracked, and we can date them to within 3 years of the year that the air sample was tracked. We can measure the carbon dioxide, and there are 2 different isotopes of oxygen which tell us the temperature at the time. Pretty amazing stuff. So what are scientists saying about sea level? How many of you have heard of the IPCC? Wow, that's amazing. I don't think I've ever seen that. That's pretty cool. I think everybody raised their hand. Wow. Anyway, well, you know what it is, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Every 5 or 6 years they give a report. The latest one, the 5th report, came out September 27th. And it's got a lot of attention because their projections for sea level rise almost doubled from the last one. They now say that if you look at the little table in the report, it says that sea level rise this century could be 10 to 32 inches higher, based upon 4 different scenarios. It's impressive that that almost doubled to 7 to 17 inches in the last report. But it's wrong. How could John Englander say that the IPCC is wrong? 2,000 scientists. They're not wrong, but it's misleading. It would lead you to think that the worst that could happen is 32 inches of sea level rise, right? By the end of the century. That's not what it says.